Politics is all around us, even in the air we breathe. 3 prime ministers and at least 2 once-in-a-generation crises later, how is the divided nation that we call Great Britain divided into a nation divided? Welcome to Emotional Labour. This is the show where we do the discourse so you don't have to. Britain is our home, and as any child of divorce will tell you, a divided home is usually a shit one. We start off the year with a flurry, not of snow or of microplastics, but of Tory resignations. Boris Johnson admitting that he got frisky at a motive with the mandem while the rest of us were forced to stay inside or die of COVID has crossed the red line for a bunch of Conservatives who were upset that they weren't invited. In February, 5 of Boris's aides resigned in the same 24 hours, which is highly unusual as there are 672 hours in February. In March, the Tories changed the law so that they could call a snap election within 25 days' notice. You'll notice that this year has been going so badly, they haven't tried to do it even once. In April, the Tories decided to introduce photo ID for voting, having panicked that they killed off half of their base during the coronavirus pandemic, which is either ongoing or long gone, depending on which minister you ask at any given time. Later this month, a Tory MP is caught watching porn in the House of Commons and is suspended. He decides to resign, presumably to focus on his true passion of having a wank at home, as opposed to all over our democracy. In May, the Tories get eviscerated, losing 485 seats. But nobody cares because it's local elections. Liz Truss abandons Northern Ireland protocol, staying consistent with the British stance on Northern Ireland, namely pretending it's not there. A completely inconsequential report by Sue Gray comes out confirming that senior politicians bear responsibility for a culture of lockdown rages at number 10. Completely coincidentally, around the same time the Johnson administration passes a bill that allows ministers to breach ministerial code with no fear of repercussion. The porn MP just needed to wait a month and he would have been fine. In June, the Johnson administration wins its no confidence vote, which is kind of like being the prettiest pig at a county fair. SNP girl boss Nicola Sturgeon announces plans to schedule a second Scottish independence referendum in 2023. Boris stays consistent with the English stance on Scottish independence, namely pretending that he's never heard of that part of Britain. The Tory whip, which is presumably some sort of weird sex thing, resigns after reports claim that he was a little too waved at a Tory rave. A few days later, it comes out that he's a sexual predator with numerous allegations over the last decade. Downing Street says that Boris was not aware of the allegations when the whip was appointed. 3 days later, Downing Street admits that Boris was aware of some of the allegations when the whip was appointed. This was immediately followed by Resignation Bowl, a day where 11 Tory MPs resigned. Not because they were shocked with working like man like Bill Cosby, which they of course already knew, but because of the Partygate scandal. Strangely, these resignations seem to have nothing to do with whether or not MPs participated in these events themselves, with low-profile cabinet minister and well-known sesh head Rishi Sunak deciding to take the moral high ground. A few days later, 21 more MPs resign. Michael Gove, because he's not like other girls, gets himself fired instead. The freshly appointed Education Secretary, Michelle Donnellan, decides to resign after a grueling 36 hours of service as Education Secretary. Boris sees how much fun everyone is having resigning and decides to resign himself, forgetting that this will now trigger a fresh leadership election, only 2.5 years after the last one, which, in British politics terms, is fucking ages. By the 11th, we have a group of 11 Tory candidates. Now, while you would be forgiven for thinking that this was instead a lineup of Scooby-Doo monsters, who would have thought that two of this motley lot would end up becoming PM? Boris, having locked himself in his room to cry and masturbate to pictures of Winston Churchill, responds by not endorsing any of them. A Labour MP is fired by Keir Starmer for joining a railway worker picket line. Some would say that this seems antithetical to a party that claims to champion labour protections. And they'd be right. It's the start of September and votes have closed for the Tory leadership election. Ex-police commissioner and Caucasian female Cressida Dick claims that she was intimidated into resigning by Mayor of London and scary brown man Sadiq Khan. The ongoing police brutality investigations into her reign as commissioner apparently have nothing to do with this whatsoever. Sadiq Khan responded by somehow turning his hair even greyer. It's September the 5th and Liz Truss is elected Prime Minister, beating Rishi in the membership vote for some reason. 3 MPs, including Priti Patel, resign, which is honestly so few nobody even noticed. The next day, Boris steps down, doing an impression of a drunken cowboy and the Roman leader Cincinnatus, famous for being asked to return home to Rome and lead them as a dictator after initially leaving office, which is definitely the sort of thing that someone who is ready to leave power would do. On September 8th, the Queen, head of state of all of these places, because of all of this, dies 2 days after meeting Liz Truss for the first time, proving that women in power only have a staying power of about 70 years. What better way to celebrate the life of the richest woman in Britain than a period of enforced national mourning, where food banks are closed so that poor people can focus on the Queen rather than hunger. 2 weeks of enforced mourning later, it's time for the funeral. and everyone is about 10 times more anti-royalist than they were before. It turns out that the more you hear about the royal family in the media, the more you start asking yourself questions like, what the fuck is going on? Why isn't my hat as nice as hers? And why is Big Suze from Peep Show an actual member of the aristocracy? Now that that's all over with, Parliament can finally come back and make some new laws what to rule us with. How are they going to tackle the cost of living crisis? That's right, legalize fracking and dump sewage into the ocean. UK interest rates rise to their highest in 30 years. The government soft launches a mini budget, which is kind of like a Tory mid-season finale, where we got the biggest tax cuts in the UK in over 50 years. Well, I say we. This really only affected the very richest, with the top income tax bracket being abolished altogether. Not for long though, as after a few days the government unabolishes the top tax rate after protests. Better luck next time, rich mates of the Tories. Unable to even make life better for the very richest, the cracks were starting to show with Liz Truss. While stumbling through a speech at the Tory party conference, she gets completely derailed by two women holding a sign. Elsewhere, a Tory MP continued the British political tradition of serial misconduct. He's later fired for this, making this the second time that this particular MP has been fired since the last time in 2020, when he tried to blackmail a company into employing his dad's business, thus proving that losing your job in British politics is less of a career ender and more of a mild inconvenience. It's October 14th. Liz sacks her new chancellor, apologizes and reverses the mini budget. Apologizing, otherwise known as showing weakness, is a career ender in the Tory party. A couple of MPs, including new Home Secretary Suella Braverman, resign in protest, which is more than enough for Liz to resign herself, triggering a fresh leadership election only about a month after the last one. The moment he hears this, Boris rushes back from his taxpayer-funded holiday to get back in the race. But then he decides to endorse Rishi after negotiations with senior Tories. Rishi becomes Prime Minister, the first British Asian and the youngest in 200 years. As a British Asian, I'd like to apologise to white women. I had no idea that this is how you felt when Thatcher came into power. Rishi rebans fracking and then goes into hiding for the rest of the year so that nobody tries to fire him too. But the fanatic and COVID-era Health Secretary Matt Hancock is suspended from the Tory party after joining the cast of the reality show I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, in an attempt to humanise himself after killing everyone's nan last winter. It doesn't work. Parliament remembers that Nicola Sturgeon said something about a second Scottish independence referendum in 2023. They respond by deciding that there won't be one, actually. As for the end of the year, things just continue getting worse. Real wages haven't increased since 2008, leading workers to go on some of the biggest strikes in British history. COVID is back with a vengeance, so is right-wing terrorism, and also bisons for some weird reason. It would be facetious to conclude this video with a glimmer of hope when this year has been so bereft of it. So I won't. That's the end. Goodbye. Has public opinion changed for good on the Tories? Is a brown man being PM the straw that breaks the camel's back? And how many bison stampedes can we expect? I'll see you for all this and more in 2023.